All right, so this is going to be talking about the muscles of the forearm, our anterior compartment, and the carpal tunnel. This starts on page 112 of your lab manual. So one thing before we get started is to have you understand that why are there so many muscles in our forearm? If you look at your lab manual, page 112 and page 113, all of those muscles listed in those two boxes are in your forearm. There's layers to them, superficial, intermediate, deep layers, and then if you look at the box for your arm, right, the muscles on your humerus, there's only four. Why the discrepancy? So if you think about mechanically how your muscles of the arm, the muscles that are extending from your humerus, they're going to go over your elbow joint, right? So they're controlling your elbow. And your elbow really does one action. It either flexes or extends, right? It's a hinging joint. So there's not a whole lot of fine movement or dexterity that you need there, because what you really need is strength, right? If you're pushing or pulling something, you want a lot of strength in that elbow joint. But if you think about your forearm, the muscles there that originate on the forearm are going to go over the wrist, and they're going to control the wrist, and they're also going to control their fingers. So movements of your wrist and fingers are very fine, and they're very precisely controlled. So there's a lot of dexterity in your hand, in your wrist. Which is why we evolved to have many smaller muscles in our forearm, so that we can have that fine dexterity of our wrist and fingers, and that there's not that many muscles in our arm because they're going to control the elbow joint, but they need to be bigger and stronger for strength. So hopefully that makes sense to you and why we have so many forearm muscles. So let's get started with the anterior forearm. So in your box, we can see that there's 3 layers to the anterior forearm. They are all the superficial, there's 4, there's 1 muscle in the intermediate layer, and there's 3 in the deep layer. So they are, in general, the muscles of your forearm on the anterior side are all flexors, right? So they're going to go cross over your wrist, they're flexing your wrist, or they are going to go into the fingers and they're going to flex your fingers. So they're all flexors. And you can say that the same is on the other side. So the opposite side of your forearm on the posterior side, if you look at the actions there, they're all going to extend. So in general, your anterior arm and forearm muscles are flexors, and in general, the posterior arm and forearm muscles are extensors. So the first one, let's start with PFPF. So I call these the PFPF muscles: pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi ulnaris. PFPF. And in fact, there's a fun little picture here. You can look at the muscles. If you place your hand, right, the 4 fingers on the opposite arm, I should say opposite forearm, the pronator teres falls near the top of, so the proximal end of your forearm. Then you have flexor carpi radialis, which is going to be on the radial side, on the thumb side of your forearm. Palmaris longus is going to land somewhere in the middle. It's a very middle muscle there. And then we have flexor carpi ulnaris, which is going to be on the ulnar side, on the pinky side of your forearm. So that's where you can find them on your body. So pronator teres is going to be a pronator muscle. You can see it. It's a small muscle up here, right? It's on the proximal end of your forearm. And it's coming from the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Actually, take a look at all your origins here, all the origins of your PFPF muscles, and that intermediate one is the same. So we can just group that in your mind mentally, that all the origin of your flexors, right, your anterior forearm, are coming from the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Then this one's going to insert on the radius, and that should make sense to you because we know that if it's a pronator, as the muscle says, right, it's going to pronate, flip the palm down. And in order to do any pronating and supinating action, remember that the muscles have to insert onto the radius. All right, so let's look at flexor carpi radialis. So this one also descriptive and tells you what it does. Flexor, it flexes. Carpi refers to wrist. It's on the radial side of your forearm. And this one will insert onto the metacarpal. So let's remember where your metacarpals are. The metacarpals are in the palm of your hand. So remember, those bones are in the palm. The bones that are in your fingers are your phalanges. So if this muscle comes in and inserts only onto the palm of your hand, it's not going to bend your fingers, is it? It's going to just pull the palm towards its origin. And if you're doing that with your own body, right, you're going to be flexing your wrist. So that's basically the action. Because it's on the radial side, it can also have this abducting action. So if you were to sort of just move the thumb side of your wrist laterally, right, you have a small abducting action. The next one on the list is palmaris longus. So this one's an interesting one. When you look at it, it's very small. It has a very small muscle belly, and then it has a very long tendon. So maybe longus refers to the tendon here. And then it becomes, this tendon radiates wide, becomes this wide, broad aponeurosis in your hand, which is called the palmar aponeurosis. So you guys should recognize and be able to identify this structure, the palmar aponeurosis, and know that it is a insertion of this muscle. The muscle also inserts onto something called the flexor retinaculum. So let's find that here, flexor retinaculum. This is a broad, well, not super broad, but it's a connective tissue that sort of wraps around your entire wrist. So think about one of those sweat bands for your wrist, you know, that tennis players used to wear, and maybe still do, but on the anterior side, it's called the flexor retinaculum, and then this band of connective tissue goes around to the back of your wrist as well, and then at that point, it's called the extensor retinaculum. You guys are going to be required to know both of those structures. So from this view, we can see the flexor retinaculum. One thing I wanted to show you is, well, let's come back to that. This is something's interesting about the palmaris longus muscle, is that it's missing in about 14% of us. So if you look at this picture, we see that if you oppose your thumb and your pinky, as what's happening in this image, on yourself, you should be able to see this tendon. So this is the palmaris longus tendon. It's going to be very visible in this action. If you don't have it, nothing, you won't see anything. So this is actually pretty common. I usually in class ask people to do this and see if they're missing their palmaris longus tendon. And then some people will definitely have one tendon in one hand and the other hand does not have it, which is, I guess, a thing. I think it happens in people because I get it all the time, every semester. It's meaningless that this muscle is a very small muscle. It doesn't mean anything about your grip strength or anything like that. So just an interesting fact. All right, now let's go to look at the flexor carpi ulnaris. So I'm going to go back. So now we're on the pinky side, right? Flexor, it flexes the wrist on the ulnar side. And same thing with the other one, flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris. They're going to insert onto the metacarpals. So this is actually a nice trick to remember. If the muscle has the word carpi in it, so we have flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, we're also going to have extensor carpi radialis and extensor carpi ulnaris. That means that the insertion is metacarpals. So if it has the word carpi in it, insertion is metacarpals. And then that's it. You're done memorizing for that. All right, so let's take a look at the flexor digitorum superficialis. All right, so this muscle is intermediate. Actually, before we move on, I'll just show you the model that we have in class. So let's see if we can figure out our PFPF. So we're looking for our first P, our pronator teres, which is a small, proximally oriented muscle. It's kind of an oblique muscle, and there it is right here. So this is pronator teres. F, our first F next to that is flexor carpi, radialis. We're on the thumb, right? Flexor carpi radialis. Our next P right here, palmaris longus. We can see the tendon coming into our flexor retinaculum. The palmar aponeurosis is missing here, if you're wondering. And then our last one is our flexor carpi ulnaris, which is on the ulnar side. So that's it. If you're taking an online test, then this muscle model will not be something that you're looking at, but I thought I'd show you anyway. Moving on to the intermediate layer, the flexor digitorum superficialis, you can see that here. So you can see a little number 26 on this model. So you can see it through the tendons of our superficial muscles. And so I'll show you the diagram form of this. So flexor digitorum superficialis, you see how it's sort of pointing to a muscle and pointing to some tendons here. That's because you can see it through the tendons of our superficial ones. So let's take a look at a image of that. Okay, so here's our intermediate flexor digitorum superficialis. So you can see it here through the tendons. I also just have a note here to take a look at the nice palmar aponeurosis picture here. And so this would be our palmaris longus muscle. All right, so the view here that you see on this side, right, this is our intermediate view. So we can really see the flexor digitorum superficialis. So let's just take a minute and look at the origin, which is the same as all your flexors. The insertion is going to be the middle phalanges of digits 2 through 5. So there's an interesting phenomenon going on in your fingers. The flexor digitorum superficialis, it's on top, right? We actually have another muscle called the flexor digitorum profundus, right? So it also flexes your digits. That's what flexor digitorum means. This one's superficial and this one's deep. So the word profundus means deep. So they both are going to flex your digits, but they flex different parts of your digits. So the flexor digitorum superficialis is going to flex your middle phalanx, and then the profundus is going to flex your distal phalanx. So if you look carefully at what's going on, and let me just show you the other picture that I have that's a little bit better. So this is flexor digitorum profundus, which goes all the way to the last phalanx here, right? Your distal phalanx, and then here your flexor digitorum superficialis, it just lands short of that on your middle one. But if you're wondering to yourself, this top muscle needs to come down first. The bottom muscle, right, the deeper muscle has to go all the way. So how does it do that physically if your superficialis muscles comes and lands down on the bone first? Is that there's this really cool, structure that happens. So FDS stands for flexor digitorum superficialis, FDP, flexor digitorum profundus. So you can see that the tendon's on top for superficialis because it's a superficial muscle, but the tendon is going to actually split to allow that deeper muscle, the tendon of the deeper one, to come up and through it so that it can actually land on the distal phalanx, whereas our superficial muscle lands on the middle phalanx, which is really cool. If you ever get a chance to see this in a cadaver, it's really mind-blowing how cool it is. Okay, so that's enough about that. So for the actions of your flexor digitorum superficialis, you can just say that it flexes that middle phalanx of digits 2 through 5. And please make a note that it is digits 2 through 5. So that's all your digits except for your thumb. So remember that your thumb had a separate name. It's the pollex. And so muscles that move the thumb are going to have the word pollicis in it. And so everything else 2 through 5 is what this muscle controls. So for the action, there's a lot of words in that action box, but I just require that you know it flexes the middle phalanx of digits 2 through 5. So pretty easy. So let's look at our last layer here, our flexor digitorum profundus, which we found here, our deepest layer. Then we have flexor pollicis longus, which now we see the word pollicis, right? So flexor pollicis longus means that it flexes the thumb. The longus means that it's a long muscle. When you see longus attached to a muscle name, it usually means that there's another muscle that does the same thing that is shorter. So there's a flexor pollicis brevis, but we're not learning that. You just need to know the flexor pollicis longus. So we see that here. So all of this is flexor pollicis longus. So in your deep compartment of your forearm, you're going to flex your fingers 2 through 5. And next to that, you're going to flex your thumb, right? So all of your fingers are taken care of flexing wise down here. The last deep muscle that we have is going to be our pronator quadratus. So here is a square quadrate, right? Quad means square muscle that is very interesting looking. Let's take you to another image here. This is pronator quadratus. And it's going to pronate, as the word says. So your choices for origin insertion should be pretty obvious, hopefully. If you're going to pronate, the insertion, right, the bone that moves has to be the radius. So if it just goes from ulna to radius, the radius has to be the insertion. The ulna is then going to be the origin. And then the pronating should be pretty easy to figure out. This is the model. I'm going to go ahead and skip that. Well, I'll just tell you this finger. They're pointing to the flexor digitorum profundus. next to that, on the other side of that, would be the flexor pollicis longus. And then here are the two pronators of your anterior forearm, right? Remember we had pronator teres at the top, which is superficial, and then we have a deep, deep pronator quadratus. All right, so those are the muscles. Now let's talk about the hand and the carpal tunnel. So this image, I just want to draw your attention to this split, right? Remember I was talking about the tendons of the flexor digitorum superficialis, how they had to actually split to allow the tendon of flexor digitorum profundus to come through, right? So the superficialis can drop down and insert onto the middle phalanx. Profundus goes all the way to the distal phalanx. I also want you to look at your flexor retinaculum here. So this is our band of connective tissue going across the wrist. I want you to look underneath. So look underneath the flexor retinaculum and look at all of the bundles of nerves and tendons that have to go through this or underneath the flexor retinaculum to get into the hand. So what you're looking at, you guys, is the carpal tunnel. So the carpal tunnel, this is an opened carpal tunnel, so we can really see all the tendons that go into the fingers. So let's take a look at these two pieces of connective tissue. So again, remember that I wanted you to know the flexor retinaculum, and I wanted you to know the extensor retinaculum on the back. So this is a picture of the posterior wrist. These retinacula basically hold the tendons of all of your muscles in place. Because they kind of tape down, like you can think of this as like a piece of tape, right, that tapes down, or a rubber band that kind of holds those tendons in place. If you are using your fingers and your wrists a lot, say in typing or in any action like that, you're going to have a lot of friction and you're going to have a lot of rubbing, and carpal tunnel syndrome is this issue with that. So take a look at the carpal tunnel. The carpal tunnel is this tunnel created by your carpals, which are concave, and then your tendons and ligaments that go through underneath your flexor retinaculum. So this one's calling it the palmar aponeurosis. It's cut a little bit further up, but that flexor retinacula creates the carpal tunnel. So what causes the pain and the discomfort and the numbness that is associated with carpal tunnel syndrome is the median nerve also travels through the carpal tunnel. So this nerve, I want you to know, I want you to know the fact that carpal tunnel syndrome, right, is explained to you here on this page, but it's this phenomenon that happens when there's swelling and inflammation that occur with these tendons through overuse or just a lot of use. The swelling can cause the tissues to, push on this median nerve, and the median nerve causes the pain or loss of sensation or numbness or muscle weakness that we all feel with carpal tunnel syndrome, if you've ever had carpal tunnel syndrome. Okay, so I want you to know that syndrome associated with the tendons of your forearm here.